Somewhere on Earth tonight, there are roughly 40 million people who carry in their DNA a quiet echo of one man. One man who was born in the dirt of the Mongolian steppe, who grew up hungry and cold and abandoned, and who went on to build the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. 40 million living descendants? That number alone should tell you something extraordinary happened out there on those windswept grasslands 8 centuries ago. Something so enormous, so sweeping, so reshaping of every civilization it touched, that its fingerprints are still pressed into the map of the modern world. The roads we think of as ancient, the borders that feel eternal, the trade routes that stitch together the farthest corners of humanity, all of it was rearranged brutally and brilliantly by the people of the Great Steppe. If this is your first time here on The Drowsy Archivist, welcome. This channel exists for the curious mind that wants to be carried somewhere far away before the night settles in completely. We tell history the way it deserves to be told, slowly, richly, without rushing past the details that make the past feel alive. Every week we dive into a different corner of human history and try to understand not just what happened, but why it mattered, how it felt, and what it left behind. If that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you never miss a new story. And if you've been here before, welcome back. You already know how this works. Tonight's story begins in a place most people have never seen and may struggle to fully picture. A landscape so vast and so empty that the sky itself feels like a physical weight pressing down on you. A land of sharp winters and burning summers, of grass that stretches to every horizon, of people who live their entire lives in motion, following the seasons, following the animals, following the imperatives of survival. This is the Mongolian Plateau, a place that, for most of human history, was considered the edge of the known world by the civilizations that surrounded it. The Chinese built walls to keep its people out. The Persian empires traded anxiously with its riders. The Arab chroniclers wrote of it as a place of mystery and danger. And for thousands of years, those assessments weren't entirely wrong. But in the early years of the 13th century, something extraordinary happened on that plateau. A boy who had once been left for dead on the open steppe, who had been a prisoner and a fugitive and a nobody, united every tribe, every clan, every family of those wild grasslands under a single banner. And then he turned his eyes outward. What followed would change the world forever. Tonight we are going to follow that story from its humble beginning, a small boy on a windswept plain, all the way to its vast and complicated ending, which is still, in many ways, unfolding around us. We'll spend time on the conquests, yes, because they are central and they cannot be minimized. But we'll also spend time on the administration, the trade, the remarkable cultural openness, and the long, slow historical consequences that connect the Mongolian steppe of the 13th century to the world you and I inhabit today. This is not a simple story. It has no simple heroes or villains. It is the story of how the world was made smaller, more interconnected, and irrevocably changed, for better and for worse, and often for both at once. To understand what the Mongols were and why they were capable of the things they did, you first have to understand the world that made them. Not just the geography, though the geography matters enormously, but the entire way of life. The values, the daily realities, the deep rhythms of existence that shaped every Mongol man, woman, and child from the moment they drew their first breath. The Mongolian Plateau sits in the heart of Central Asia, a vast elevated grassland bounded to the north by the forests of Siberia, to the south by the Gobi Desert, to the east by the forests and farmlands of Manchuria, and to the west by the mountain ranges of Central Asia. It is not a welcoming landscape. The winters here are brutal in ways that are hard to fully convey, temperatures regularly plunging to -40 degrees, winds that cut through any barrier you put against them, snows that can cover the grazing lands and starve entire herds of animals within days. The summers are short and fierce, the sun hammering down on grasslands that can turn to dust with a few weeks of insufficient rain. This is a place that does not forgive weakness. It never has. The people who lived here were, by absolute necessity, nomads. Not in the romanticized sense of wanderers who moved freely for the love of it, but in the deeply practical sense of people who followed the seasons because to stop moving was to die. They kept herds, horses, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and they moved those herds from summer pastures to winter pastures in patterns that had been refined over generations. They lived in jairs, those famous round felt tents that can be assembled and disassembled in less than an hour, because no permanent structure made sense in a life built around constant movement. Every possession a Mongol family owned had to be portable. Every skill they developed had to serve the demands of a mobile life. And what a set of skills those were. Mongol children could ride before they could walk with any confidence. This is not a figure of speech but a near-literal description of their upbringing. Infants were placed on horses and held there by older family members. Children learned to manage their own ponies by the age of 3 or 4. By the time a Mongol boy was 6 or 7 years old, he was already competent at riding at speed, already beginning to train with the bow. The composite bow itself, that engineering marvel of horn, wood, and sinew that would later terrify the armies of half the world, was as natural to a Mongol as a pen is to a scholar. Boys spent countless hours every day pulling the bow, strengthening the specific muscles required, learning to breathe correctly, learning to release at the exact moment of stillness between strides when a galloping horse briefly suspends its motion. This was not military training. This was survival training. You needed to hunt. You needed to defend your herd. You needed to protect your family from the raids that were a constant fact of steppe life. Because the steppe was not peaceful. Far from it. The world that shaped the Mongols was a world of near-constant low-level violence. The plateau was divided among dozens of tribal groups and clans, and raiding was essentially a fundamental economic activity. If your herd suffered during a hard winter, you raided your neighbors to replace your losses. If your neighbors grew too powerful, you organized a coalition and struck before they could strike you. Alliances shifted constantly. The friend of this season was frequently the enemy of the next. Kidnapping was common, both of people and of animals. Women were taken as wives in raids, children were taken as slaves, horses and cattle were driven off under cover of darkness. In this environment, the only security you had came from the loyalty of your clan, the strength of your alliances, and your own personal capability in combat. The social structure of the Mongolian tribes in the late 12th century was organized around the concept of the clan, the extended family group that shared descent from a common ancestor. Above the clan level were larger tribal confederations, and above those were occasional alliances of confederations. But these larger structures were deeply unstable. Leadership passed not through any fixed system of primogeniture but through a combination of birth, personality, and demonstrated ability. A Khan who couldn't deliver raids, couldn't protect his people, couldn't attract followers through the promise of wealth and security, would find his followers melting away to join someone who could. This constant competition for followers created a kind of Darwinian pressure on Mongol leadership. Only the genuinely capable tended to hold power for long. There was also a spiritual dimension to this world that shaped everything about it. The Mongols practiced a form of shamanism, an animistic belief system centered on the idea that the world was filled with spirits, of the sky, of the earth, of the ancestors, of particular sacred mountains and rivers. The most important deity was Tingri, the eternal blue sky, whose will was interpreted through shamans and whose favor or displeasure could explain the rise and fall of individuals and peoples. The idea that a great leader was specially chosen by Tingri, that his victories were the expression of divine will working through him, was not just propaganda. It was a genuinely held belief that shaped how Mongols understood their own history as it was unfolding. When Genghis Khan later told his followers that Tingri had given him the mandate to rule the world, he was expressing something that resonated with the deepest spiritual instincts of his people. The tribes of the late 12th century Mongolian plateau were not a unified people in any meaningful political sense. They shared a language, or rather a family of related dialects, and broadly similar cultural practices, but they were organized into separate and often hostile groups. The major tribal groupings of this era included the Mongols proper, the Tatars, the Karaites, the Naimans, and the Merakits, among others. Each of these groups had its own leadership, its own territories, its own alliances and enmities. The Tatars and the Mongols, for example, had a particularly poisonous relationship. Generations of mutual raiding and killing had created a deep well of hatred between them. The Karaites were notable for having converted to Nestorian Christianity, making them a Christian tribe in the heart of Asia. The Naimans, in the western part of the plateau, had closer ties to the literate, more urbanized cultures of Central Asia and had adopted a writing system. All of this fragmentation and constant internal conflict had consequences that stretched far beyond the steppe itself. The great sedentary empires on the borders of the Mongolian world, the Jin dynasty in northern China, the Xia kingdom of the Tanguts, the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, had learned over centuries to manage the nomadic peoples on their frontiers through a combination of military pressure, economic incentives, and the deliberate encouragement of tribal divisions. A united nomadic people was a terrifying prospect for any agricultural empire. So these settled powers worked actively to keep the steppe peoples divided, sometimes even paying one tribe to fight another. The Jin dynasty of northern China had a particularly active policy in this regard, periodically sending military expeditions into the steppe to kill the most powerful tribal leaders before they could consolidate too much power. This was the world into which Temüjin was born, sometime around 1162, near the Onan River in what is now northeastern Mongolia. A world defined by cold, hardship, constant violence, shifting loyalties, and the ever-present possibility of catastrophic reversal. A world that would, in an almost perfectly paradoxical way, produce the man most responsible for ending it. The horses of the steppe were small by the standards of the great cavalry mounts of Europe or Persia, stocky, thick-necked creatures with extraordinary endurance. A Mongolian horse could cover distances that would kill a European destrier. They could survive on the sparse grasses of the steppe where other breeds would starve. They needed almost no care compared to the pampered war horses of the West. And the Mongols rode them with a total integration of horse and rider that no other culture in the world could match. When a Mongol warrior rode, he didn't just sit on a horse. He became part of the horse. The famous recurved stirrup that Mongols used gave them a platform from which they could stand almost upright at a full gallop, giving their arrows a much steadier platform than any other mounted archer in the world. They could twist their bodies 180 degrees while riding at full speed, the famous Parthian shot, to fire backward at pursuing enemies. This wasn't a trick. This was a fundamental battle tactic. These horses were also, from a logistical standpoint, the engine of the Mongol military machine. A Mongol warrior on campaign traveled with multiple mounts, typically 3 to 5 horses per rider, and rotated through them so that no animal was ever ridden to exhaustion. The ponies could forage for themselves on the steppe, requiring no grain supply that had to be carried and defended. This made the Mongol army, in terms of its relationship to food and supply, nearly self-sustaining across the grasslands. A logistical miracle that no sedentary army could replicate without enormous infrastructure. When you add to this the warrior's own ability to survive on minimal rations, dried meat pressed into pouches, fermented mare's milk, occasional blood drawn from a horse's vein in true extremis, you begin to understand why the Mongol military could operate at distances and speeds that seemed impossible to everyone who faced it. Every boy also learned to hunt from horseback, and this is important in ways that historians sometimes understate. The great hunting drives, the nurge, that the Mongols practiced were not merely a source of food and sport. They were a formalized military training exercise conducted on a massive scale. In a nurge, hundreds or even thousands of riders would form a vast encircling ring around a stretch of territory and then gradually close the ring, driving all the game animals in that area toward the center while maintaining tight coordination. The skill required to do this, to hold your position in the line, to communicate with riders too distant to hear your voice, to respond instantly to signals and adjust your movement accordingly, was exactly the skill required to execute the famous encirclement tactics that the Mongol military would later perfect on the battlefield. The nurge was, in effect, a rehearsal for war conducted in the form of a hunt. Every Mongol man participated in these drives from boyhood, internalizing the tactical principles without ever thinking of them as military training. Life on the steppe also created a certain psychology that would later become militarily decisive. The Mongols were accustomed to hardship in ways that soldiers from agricultural civilizations were not. A Mongol warrior could ride for days on minimal food, sustaining himself on dried meat, mare's milk fermented into arag, and in extremis, blood drawn from a vein in his horse's neck and drunk warm. He could sleep in the saddle, navigate by stars and wind and the subtle features of the landscape, endure cold that would incapacitate most soldiers from temperate zones. He was not afraid of death in the way that men who had comfortable lives to return to were afraid of death. He had grown up in a world where death was always close. This was a population psychologically prepared for military life in a way that no agricultural civilization could replicate simply by training soldiers. The life of Temüjin before he became Genghis Khan is one of the most extraordinary rags-to-power stories in human history. But it is important not to sentimentalize it. His early life was not merely difficult. It was a sustained experience of dispossession, abandonment, imprisonment, and survival that would have broken most people entirely. What it did to Temüjin instead was forge him into something harder and more dangerous than the steppe had ever produced. Temüjin was the son of a man named Yasugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan of the Mongols. The Borjigin were not among the most powerful clans on the plateau, but they had a tradition of leadership and some degree of prestige. Yasugei himself was a capable fighter with a talent for alliance-making. He was a close associate of Togrul, the powerful Khan of the Karat tribe. When Temüjin was born, Yasugei had just returned from a raid against a Tatar camp, and he named his new son after a Tatar leader he had captured in battle. This was a custom on the steppe. Naming a newborn after a captured enemy was thought to absorb some of the enemy's strength. The name Temüjin is thought to derive from a word related to iron or blacksmith, though this connection is somewhat uncertain. The ancient Mongolian text known as the Secret History of the Mongols, compiled by anonymous authors after Genghis Khan's death, probably in the 1220s or 1230s, records that Temüjin was born clutching a blood clot in his right hand. This was interpreted as a sign of great destiny. Whether this detail is literal or legendary is impossible to know, but it reflects the way his people came to understand the remarkable arc of his life, as something that had been written in the moment of his birth, as a man touched from the very beginning by something extraordinary. Temüjin's early childhood, insofar as we can reconstruct it, was unremarkable for the steppe, which is to say it was hard. He grew up learning to ride and shoot and herd animals, spending long days on horseback across the grasslands, absorbing the rhythms of nomadic life. When he was around 8 or 9 years old, the sources give slightly different ages, reflecting the oral tradition's imprecision about dates. His father Yasugei decided it was time to arrange his betrothal. This was standard practice on the steppe. Alliances were built through marriage, and the sooner you could begin weaving those connections, the better. Yasugei traveled with young Temüjin to the lands of the Ongjurat tribe, a group known for producing beautiful and capable wives for the great families of the steppe. There he found a girl named Borte, daughter of a chieftain named Sechin, who possessed not just beauty but, by all accounts, considerable intelligence and force of character. The betrothal was arranged. According to custom, Temüjin was left in the household of Sechin to work and prove himself. This was how a young man earned his bride price on the steppe. Yasugei rode home alone. And on the road home he made a fatal error of courtesy. He stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars, the ancient enemies of his clan, relying on the steppe tradition of hospitality to strangers. The Tatars recognized him, and they poisoned his food. Yasugei managed to ride back to his own people, already weakening from the poison. He sent a messenger to retrieve Temüjin from the Ongjurat household. But by the time Temüjin arrived, his father was dying, and within days of his son's return, Yasugei was dead. Temüjin was approximately 9 years old and had just become the nominal head of his family. What happened next was one of the defining catastrophes of Temüjin's young life and, in a strange way, one of the most important experiences in shaping who he would become. The other families of Yasugei's small camp, the people who had owed Yasugei loyalty, who had followed him, who had depended on him, simply left. They packed up their dares and their animals and rode away, abandoning Yasugei's widow Hoelin and her children to survive on their own in the open steppe. This was not an unusual outcome in steppe society. A dead leader's followers had no obligation to support his widow and children. They needed to align themselves with the living. But for Hoelin and her children, it meant destitution. The family's survival during the years that followed was precarious in ways that are difficult to imagine. Hoelin, a woman of remarkable resourcefulness and strength, foraged wild foods, roots, berries, small animals, to keep her children alive. The children hunted small game with whatever equipment they had. They lived on the margins of survival, perpetually vulnerable to raids from other tribes who knew perfectly well that a widow with children had almost no protection. Temüjin's half-brother Better began to emerge as a competitor for scarce food resources, hoarding catches rather than sharing them with the family. In an incident that the secret history records without flinching, the young Temüjin and his full brother Khosar ambushed Better on the steppe and killed him. This was a fratricide born of desperation rather than malice, but it reveals something important about the world Temüjin was growing up in. Survival was not guaranteed, resources were genuinely scarce, and ruthlessness was not a vice but a necessity. There was also a period during which Temüjin was captured. A rival clan, the Taikit, decided that Yasugei's son was becoming dangerous and seized him, forcing him to wear a kang, a heavy wooden collar that kept the arms spread and made independent movement almost impossible. He was kept as a slave, moved from camp to camp, subjected to the daily humiliation of captivity. His eventual escape, in which he was aided by a sympathetic family who helped conceal him, required not just courage but social intelligence, the ability to identify allies and exploit opportunities in a situation where he had essentially no power. He escaped. He made it back to his family. And he kept moving forward. As Temüjin entered his late teens and early 20s, his circumstances began to improve. His father's old connection still held some value. The alliance with Togrul, the Kari Khan, could be revived, and Temüjin pursued it actively. He also had his betrothal to Borte to fulfill, and fulfilling it gave him both a brilliant wife and a connection to the Ongjurat tribe. The gift he offered to Togrul upon renewing their alliance was a coat of black sable that Borte had brought as part of her dowry, a deliberately chosen symbol of good faith and serious intent. Borte's influence on Temüjin's life and success is difficult to overstate. and it is often underplayed in popular accounts that focus exclusively on military campaigns. She was his primary advisor, a woman of sharp political intelligence who consistently counseled patience, long-term thinking, and careful alliance management. When her counsel and Temüjin's instincts pointed in the same direction, they were almost always right. Her kidnapping, which occurred shortly after their marriage, Merkit raiders seized her in retaliation for Yusujai's long-ago abduction of Hoilan from a Merkit man, was the catalyst for a major alliance-building exercise that showed Temüjin's emerging political genius. He mobilized his alliance with Togrul and with his blood brother Jamuka to mount a rescue operation, combining their forces to strike the Marakop camps and retrieve Borte. It worked, and the experience of coordinating that operation left Temüjin with valuable lessons about what coalition warfare looked like, what held alliances together, and what caused them to fracture. The relationship between Temüjin and Jamuka is one of the most fascinating and psychologically rich dynamics of the entire story. They were Anda, sworn brothers, bound by a ritual of brotherhood that was among the most sacred relationships the steppe recognized. They had known each other from childhood, had exchanged gifts and sworn oaths and ridden together, and for a time their partnership worked. They complemented each other in certain ways, but they represented genuinely different visions of what the steppe should be. Jamuka was an aristocrat in the traditional steppe sense. He believed in the existing social hierarchy, in the right of noble blood to rule, in the preservation of the clan and tribal system that organized Mongolian society. Temüjin believed in something else entirely. He believed in merit. He believed that the best man for a job should have it, regardless of the circumstances of his birth. He believed in a kind of fluid meritocracy that was deeply threatening to the traditional aristocracy because it implied that birth did not guarantee position. This ideological difference was not the only source of tension between them. There was also simply the reality of two powerful personalities competing for the same pool of followers. Steppe leadership was personal. Men followed individuals, not institutions, and the same man could not follow two leaders simultaneously. As Temüjin's reputation grew and his ability to deliver safety, food, and revenge became clear to the wider steppe community, men began choosing him over Jamuka. And as they did, the former blood brothers moved inexorably toward confrontation. Their final rupture came around 1187, when Jamuka inflicted a serious defeat on Temüjin at a battle near Dallin Baljit. The defeat scattered Temüjin's forces and set him back considerably. Some historians, following contemporary records, believe he may have spent years afterward in the service of the Jin dynasty in northern China, a humiliation so great that Mongolian sources later carefully omitted any mention of it. But he survived. He regrouped, and he returned. Women, in the world of the Mongolian steppe, occupied a position of real practical importance that was more nuanced than the simple warrior culture stereotype might suggest. The gur was the woman's domain in a deep and formal sense. The felt tent was her property, and a husband who entered his own home was, in a sense, entering his wife's space. The care and management of the family's resources, the food stores, the wool and felt processing, the raising of children, were serious economic responsibilities that required real skill and intelligence. Mongol women were not secluded or particularly restricted in their movement. Hoilan, Temüjin's mother, led their family through years of near starvation with a competence and determination that earned genuine respect in later Mongolian historical memory. Borte would advise and support Temüjin throughout their marriage in ways that went far beyond the domestic sphere. The wives of Mongol rulers were not ornaments. They were political partners, managers of vast household economies, and in the frequent absences of their husbands on campaign, the effective rulers of whatever territory was under their family's control. The years between Temüjin's defeat at Dallin Baljit and his reemergence as a major force on the steppe are obscure in the historical record, but they were clearly years of quiet coalition building. He was gathering allies, one by one, with the patience and strategic intelligence that characterized his entire career. He was offering something that other leaders couldn't or wouldn't offer: fair shares of plunder, protection for the weak as well as the strong, and above all, the promise of a new kind of organization where a man's position depended on what he could do rather than who he had been born to. The famous Baljuna Covenant, in which a small group of Temüjin's most loyal followers gathered around a muddy waterhole in a moment of crisis and shared the bitter water as a symbol of their shared commitment, became one of the founding myths of the Mongol Empire. The men who drank in Baljuna were never forgotten. They were the original core, the ones who had been there in the darkest days. The decade between roughly 1196 and 1206 was the period in which Temüjin transformed himself from a capable Mongolian chieftain into something the steppe had never seen: the undisputed ruler of all its peoples. The process was not clean or simple. It required military brilliance, diplomatic skill, the willingness to commit acts of terrible violence, and a fundamental reimagining of how nomadic society could be organized. By the end of it, the steppe was unrecognizable. Temüjin's return to prominence after his years of obscurity was catalyzed by his alliance with Togrul of the Karaite. In 1196, a Jin dynasty military expedition into the steppe offered an opportunity that Temüjin seized with both hands. Jointly with Togrul, he led a campaign against the Tatars, those ancient enemies of his family who had poisoned his father, and performed so well that the Jin recognized him with a minor title. More importantly, the campaign solidified his military reputation and gave him a share of the plunder that allowed him to reward his followers and attract new ones. Over the following years, the campaign against the Tatars continued and intensified. Temüjin's approach to the Tatars after their final defeat was revolutionary and, in its cold ruthlessness, revealing. He ordered that all Tatar males taller than the linchpin of a cart axle should be killed. This was genocide. But it was also a calculated policy. By eliminating the Tatar male leadership and fighting population, Temüjin ensured that the Tatars could never again be a threat. The women and children were absorbed into his own following, integrated into the Mongol social structure, and given new identities as Mongols. This combination, total destruction of resistance, complete absorption of the survivors, would become a template for Mongol policy more broadly. The breaking of his alliance with Togrul came in 1203. Togrul had grown increasingly anxious about Temüjin's rising power. The Karaite Khan had been Temüjin's patron and protector. He had positioned himself as the senior partner in their alliance, the established power accommodating an ambitious protege. But the balance had shifted. Temüjin was no longer the junior partner. He was becoming clearly the dominant force on the steppe. Togrul's son and advisors pushed for action against Temüjin before it was too late. Togrul launched a surprise attack. Temüjin was caught unprepared, and his forces were badly disrupted. Many of his followers fled. It looked briefly like the end. It was not the end. Temüjin rallied his core supporters at a waterhole called Baljuna, the Baljuna Covenant, and organized a counter-campaign that demonstrated perhaps his greatest quality as a military leader. His ability to transform defeat into victory by understanding exactly where and when to strike back. His intelligence network told him when Togrul's forces were scattered. When the opportunity existed for a concentrated blow, he struck. In a series of engagements, he destroyed Togrul's military capability and broke the Karaite Confederation. Togrul himself fled westward and was killed by the Naimans. The Karaite people were absorbed into Temüjin's growing following. The Naiman Confederation to the west was the last major power on the Mongolian plateau. Under their Tian Khan, they represented a genuine threat. They were numerous, they were formidably armed, and they had connections to the literate, organized cultures of Central Asia. Tian Khan had been building a coalition against Temüjin, gathering around him the remnants of all the groups Temüjin had defeated: the Tatars, the Merakits, the Karaites. In a series of engagements in 1204, Temüjin shattered this coalition. Tian Khan died in the fighting. His son Kuklug escaped westward, where he would cause trouble in Central Asia for years. There was also the matter of Jamuka. The old blood brother, the old rival, had attached himself to various coalitions against Temüjin over the years. After the defeat of the Naimans, Jamuka found himself without allies or options. His own followers betrayed him, bringing him to Temüjin in the hope of receiving a reward. Temüjin had those men executed immediately. A man who would betray his own leader was untrustworthy to anyone. But with Jamuka himself, the encounter was something more complex. The two men spoke, and what passed between them we can only imagine. Jamuka reportedly asked for a noble death, not the slow, humiliating death of a common prisoner, but the clean death of a warrior. Temüjin granted it. His old blood brother, his old rival, the man who had in some ways been his shadow self for 30 years, was killed without the shedding of blood, strangled, likely, which was the Mongol noble death. There is something in this that, even across 8 centuries, carries an emotional weight. Now Temüjin stood alone on the Mongolian plateau. There were no more rivals. There was no one left to fight. In the spring of 1206, he called a great Kurultai, a formal assembly of all the tribes and clans of the steppe, beside the Onon River where he had been born. The white standards of the horsetail banner were raised. The shaman Ted Tengri declared, in the hearing of all the gathered people of the steppe, that Tengri, the eternal blue sky, had granted Temüjin dominion over all the peoples of the felt-walled tents. And Temüjin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The title itself has been the subject of scholarly debate for generations. The most widely accepted interpretation is that it means something like universal ruler or oceanic ruler. The word Genghis or Chinggis being related to a Turkic word for ocean or sea, with the connotation of vastness, of limitlessness. It was not a modest title. It did not describe a regional chieftain or a tribal leader. It described, in its very name, someone whose authority was meant to be total and boundless as the ocean that marked the edges of the known world. What Genghis Khan did immediately after his proclamation is as important as the proclamation itself, because it tells you everything about what he actually understood about power and organization. He didn't simply celebrate. He reorganized completely. The old tribal and clan structure of Mongolian society was dismantled and replaced with something entirely new. A decimal military administrative organization in which every man was assigned to a unit of 10, every 10 to a unit of 100, every 100 to 1,000, and every 1,000 to a 10,000, the Tumen. These units were deliberately scrambled across tribal and clan lines. Mongols from different tribes and clans were assigned to the same units, forced to serve together, to depend on each other, to build loyalty across the old divisions. This was revolutionary. It destroyed the primary organizing principle of steppe life, the clan, and replaced it with a new primary loyalty to the Mongol nation and its great Khan. Leadership within this structure was based on merit and demonstrated ability, not birth. A man of low birth who was a brilliant commander could rise to lead a chuman of 10,000 warriors. A man of noble birth who was incompetent would find himself in a subordinate position. This was deeply threatening to the traditional aristocracy, but enormously appealing to the mass of ordinary fighting men who had always been limited by the accident of their birth. Genghis Khan's army was the most genuinely meritocratic military organization the medieval world had ever seen. He also created new institutions that would prove essential to the empire's later functioning. A system of written law, the Great Yasa, codified the rules that all Mongols were expected to follow. A writing system, borrowed from the Uyghurs, was adopted for the Mongolian language, giving the empire the administrative tool of written communication. A postal relay system, the Yam, was established. A network of way stations with fresh horses where riders could change mounts, allowing messages and orders to travel across the steppe at speeds previously unimaginable. These institutional innovations were as important as any military victory in explaining how the Mongol Empire would eventually function. The Great Yasa, Genghis Khan's legal code, is worth dwelling on for a moment because it represents something genuinely novel for the nomadic world. It addressed a remarkable range of issues: trade regulations, treatment of envoys, whose safety was absolutely guaranteed under penalty of death, rules about the division of plunder, prohibitions on wasteful use of resources, protections for artisans and craftsmen. It also guaranteed religious freedom, which was not a feature one might expect from a conqueror, but which reflected both practical wisdom. A religiously tolerant empire was an empire with fewer internal conflicts, and perhaps a genuine philosophical openness that characterized the Mongols at their best. One of the most striking provisions of the Great Yasa was the absolute protection it granted to ambassadors and envoys. In a world where diplomatic missions frequently risked the lives of those who undertook them, the Mongol guarantee of safe passage to any recognized messenger or diplomat was remarkably firm. The penalty for killing an ambassador was death, applied without exception. This was not merely a courtesy, it was a strategic instrument. The Mongols needed reliable communication channels with the kingdoms and empires they were about to conquer, because those channels were how surrender terms were offered and accepted. A city that knew its negotiators would not be harmed was a city that could be persuaded to surrender without a costly siege. This is why the killing of Genghis Khan's trade envoy and ambassadors by the Khwarezmian Shah was so consequential. It was not just an insult but the closing of the one channel through which a catastrophic war might have been avoided, and Genghis Khan responded to it as such. The treatment of artisans and skilled craftsmen within the Great Yasa also deserves attention because it reveals something important about the Mongols' understanding of what made civilizations valuable. When they destroyed a city, they were not simply killing everything inside it, they were sorting it. The unskilled, the military-age men who had resisted, the leadership that had defied Mongol authority, these faced death. But engineers, physicians, astronomers, goldsmiths, weavers of luxury textiles, architects, scholars who could translate and transcribe, these were extracted from the wreckage of conquered cities and taken into Mongol service. This was systematic intellectual harvesting. Over the course of decades of conquest, the Mongol court and the armies themselves accumulated the expertise of every civilization they had overrun, and this human capital was what allowed them to do things, like build effective siege engines or maintain complex administrative systems, or conduct sophisticated medical care on campaign, that their own nomadic tradition alone would not have prepared them for. The transformation of the steppe was complete. Where there had been dozens of fractious, competing groups, there was now one unified nation. Where there had been constant raiding and counter-raiding, there was now relative internal peace, enforced by the certain knowledge that Genghis Khan would deal with internal unrest swiftly and brutally. And this unified, organized, militarized nation was now ready to look beyond the steppe. In 1209, Genghis Khan led his first major expedition against the neighboring kingdoms, the Xixia, the kingdom of the Tangut people on the western edge of China. The era of conquest was beginning. Before we can fully appreciate the astonishing rapidity and completeness of Mongol conquests, we need to understand exactly what made their military so overwhelmingly effective. Because the Mongols were not simply fierce fighters who overwhelmed their enemies with numbers. Indeed, they were frequently outnumbered. What they had instead was a combination of technological advantages, organizational innovations, tactical sophistication, and psychological warfare that added up to something that no army they faced was equipped to deal with. Start with the composite bow. This weapon is so central to Mongol military success that it deserves its own detailed treatment. The Mongol composite bow was a masterpiece of pre-industrial engineering, constructed from a core of wood with layers of horn bonded to the belly of the bow and layers of sinew bonded to the back. This combination created a bow that, despite being compact enough to be used from horseback, had a draw weight and stored energy that exceeded those of most other bows of the era. The recurved shape, the distinctive S-curve that distinguished it from simple wooden bows, allowed for a shorter overall length without sacrificing power. A Mongol composite bow had an effective range of somewhere between 250 and 350 meters, depending on the specific design and the arrow used. For comparison, the famous English longbow, rightfully celebrated as one of the most effective military bows of the medieval period, had an effective range of roughly 230 to 270 meters. The Mongol bow outranged it. But range alone does not explain the bow's military significance. What mattered equally was the rate of fire, and here the Mongols had a decisive advantage. A skilled Mongol archer on horseback could release 6 or more arrows per minute with accurate aim. He could do this at a full gallop, controlling his horse with his knees while both hands managed the bow. He could twist backward on his saddle and fire accurately at targets behind him. The famous Parthian shot, named after the Parthian cavalry archers of ancient Persia who had perfected similar techniques centuries earlier. He could fire in any direction at any angle, without stopping his horse or presenting a stationary target to enemy archers. The military implication of this was devastating. Against any army that relied on stationary or slow-moving formations of infantry or heavy cavalry, the Mongol mounted archers could simply maintain a distance too great for the enemy to close easily, and pour arrows into them continuously. A formation of European knights in heavy armor, for example, was essentially unable to close with Mongol cavalry. The horses were too fast, the terrain too wide, and the constant arrow fire made any charge across open ground suicidal. The only way to engage Mongol cavalry effectively was to either trap them in terrain where mobility was limited, or to have your own mounted archers of comparable skill. Very few armies in the medieval world had the second of these options. The cavalry itself was organized into 2 broad types. The light cavalry of horse archers, who constituted the majority of the Mongol force and who provided the devastating ranged fire that opened most engagements, and the heavier cavalry who carried lances and sabers and who delivered the final, devastating blow when the enemy formation had been sufficiently disrupted by arrow fire. The 2 types worked together in a choreographed sequence that was practiced to perfection. The light cavalry would screen the front, wearing down the enemy with arrows and feigning retreats to draw them forward, while the heavy cavalry waited, poised, for the moment when the enemy had committed fully to a pursuit and become disordered. Then the heavy cavalry would appear, sometimes from a concealed position, sometimes wheeling around from the flanks, and strike with irresistible force. The feigned retreat was perhaps the single most deadly and most exploited tactical innovation in the Mongol arsenal. An element of Mongol cavalry would advance aggressively, engage briefly, and then appear to break and flee in disorder. This was irresistible bait for the cavalry of almost every other culture. In European and Islamic military doctrine alike, a fleeing enemy was an enemy to be pursued, and a successful cavalry charge that broke the enemy and turned their retreat into a rout was the decisive moment of battle. So the opposing cavalry would break ranks and charge after the fleeing Mongols, galloping at full speed, their formation dissolving as the faster horses outpaced the slower ones, their supply of arrows and their horses' wind beginning to exhaust. And then the fleeing Mongols would separate, wheel, and return. From the sides and rear, Other Mongol cavalry that had been waiting just below a ridge or behind a fold in the terrain would appear. The pursuing cavalry found themselves suddenly surrounded on three sides, their horses blown, their formation scattered, with Mongol archers on every side pouring arrows into them from close range. This was not just a tactic. It was a trap so effective that it worked repeatedly against armies that had every reason to know about it and to be alert for it. Because to refuse the bait, to refuse to pursue what looked like a fleeing enemy, required a discipline and a control over your own instincts that was very difficult to maintain in the chaos and emotion of battle. Another essential component of Mongol military dominance was their approach to logistics and supply. Most medieval armies were limited in how far they could operate from a supply base because they needed to carry or forage large quantities of food, for both the soldiers and, especially, for the horses. Mongol cavalry solved this problem in a way that was uniquely suited to their culture. Each warrior brought multiple horses, typically 3 to 5 mounts, sometimes more, that were rotated throughout the marching campaign so that no single animal was ever ridden to exhaustion. When the column needed to move at speed, a warrior would shift from one horse to the next without stopping, maintaining the column's pace over distances that would have crippled any other cavalry force. The Mongolian steppe pony's ability to survive on minimal fodder and in extreme temperatures meant that a Mongol force could operate in environments where other cavalry would have lost their horses within days. Food for the warriors themselves was a challenge that the Mongols addressed with characteristically pragmatic ruthlessness. In the field, Mongol soldiers traveled on dried meat and milk products that were light and caloric. In extremis, they could bleed their horses and drink the blood. They could live off the land in ways that soldiers trained for garrison life and regular supply lines could not. The practical result of all this was a Mongol force that could cover distances that were, to contemporary observers, almost literally unbelievable. There are documented instances of Mongol cavalry covering more than 100 miles in a single day, possible because of the horse rotation system and the minimal physical burden on each individual animal. Western European cavalry of the same period might manage 15 to 30 miles a day while on campaign. The Mongol military moved at a speed that fundamentally altered what was possible in terms of strategy and surprise. Intelligence and reconnaissance were developed to a degree that was extraordinary for the pre-modern world. Before any major campaign, Mongol agents, merchants, diplomats, deserters from the target kingdom, spies operating under commercial cover, were deployed to gather information about the enemy's forces, their leadership, their political divisions, their supply systems, their terrain. The Mongols genuinely understood the principle, often attributed to a much later military tradition, that battles are won in the planning stages. By the time a Mongol army actually crossed a frontier to begin a campaign, its leadership typically had a detailed picture of what they would face, where the key fortifications were, who the important commanders were, and what their weaknesses and vulnerabilities looked like. This informational advantage often proved as decisive as any tactical innovation. Psychological warfare was elevated by the Mongols to a strategic tool of the first order. The terror they created was not incidental to their conquests, it was deliberately cultivated and deployed. Cities that refused to surrender after a demand were often destroyed with extreme completeness, their populations massacred, their buildings burned, their wells filled in. This was not simply wanton destruction. It was a calculated message to every other city in the region. Submit now and you will be spared. Resist and what happened here will happen to you. Survivors of destroyed cities were sometimes deliberately released and sent to neighboring settlements with their accounts of what they had witnessed. The advancing Mongols wanted the news to run ahead of them. They wanted to arrive at a city whose defenders had spent weeks or months in growing terror, whose resolve had been wearing thin long before the first Mongol horsemen appeared on the horizon. In many cases, this psychological preparation was sufficient. Cities surrendered without a fight because the cost of resistance seemed unbearably clear. When they encountered the challenge of fortified cities, a challenge the nomadic steppe had not traditionally prepared them for, the Mongols adapted with a speed and thoroughness that demonstrated their genuine intellectual flexibility. After their first campaigns against the walled cities of China, they recognized immediately that horse archers alone could not take fortified positions. They solved this problem in the most direct possible way. They recruited the best siege engineers they could find from China, from Central Asia, from Persia, and integrated them into their military organization. By the time they were campaigning against the great cities of the Islamic world in Eastern Europe, the Mongol army brought with it a formidable engineering corps capable of constructing trebuchets, mangonels, ballistas, and mining tunnels, of diverting water supplies, of constructing siege towers and battering rams. They used fire systematically, sometimes deploying incendiary devices that used naphtha or other combustible materials. They are even credited with some of the earliest uses of biological warfare, the catapulting of plague-infected corpses into besieged cities, which reportedly helped speed the eventual spread of the Black Death into Europe, though this particular claim is still debated by historians. The Mongol decimal organizational system also had profound implications for battlefield communication. Every unit had a commander. Every commander had clear protocols for responding to signals, flags by day, lanterns by night, that allowed the overall commander to direct the actions of tens of thousands of warriors across a wide battlefield in real time. This was something that European armies, with their feudal chain of command and their reliance on individual initiative by noble cavalry leaders, simply could not match. A Mongol army of 50,000 men could execute a coordinated multi-directional attack with the precision of a single organism. A European or Islamic army of similar size was, by comparison, a collection of separately acting units that might or might not move in coordination depending on the personal relationships between their commanders. The cumulative effect of all these advantages, the composite bow, the horse mobility, the feigned retreat, the logistics, the intelligence, the siege engineering, the psychological warfare, the organizational clarity, was a military force that was not merely superior to its opponents. It was qualitatively different from them. It operated according to principles that the armies it faced had not encountered and were not conceptually equipped to deal with. This is why the Mongol conquest happened so fast. This is why the great cities and kingdoms and empires of the medieval world fell before them in such rapid succession. It was not fate or divine intervention. It was the systematic application of a genuinely superior military system by people who had been training for it, consciously or not, since birth. With the steppe unified and the Mongol military machine assembled, Genghis Khan turned toward the great sedentary civilizations on his borders. The campaigns that followed over the next 2 decades were among the most transformative events in the history of the medieval world, not just in terms of the destruction they caused, but in terms of the new political realities they created and the connections between previously isolated civilizations that they forced open. The first major target was the Xia, the kingdom of the Tangut people that lay along the Yellow River in what is now northwestern China. The Tanguts had a sophisticated Buddhist civilization with their own written language and a long history of cultural contact with both China and the Tibetan world. Their kingdom controlled important passes and trading routes along the eastern end of the Silk Road. Genghis Khan had raided them in 1209 with an expedition that forced submission and established tribute relations. But submission was not what Genghis Khan ultimately wanted from his neighbors. He wanted either complete incorporation into the Mongol system or complete destruction. The Xi's repeated failure to provide the military support he demanded when the major campaigns against China began would eventually seal their fate. Their final destruction came during the last campaign of Genghis Khan's life, in 1226 and 1227. More immediately important was the campaign against the Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin were a dynasty of Jurchen origin, another steppe people who had conquered northern China in the early 12th century and adopted Chinese imperial institutions. Despite their own steppe heritage, they had maintained the Chinese strategy of using the Tatars and other steppe groups to counter Mongol power, and they had executed Mongolian leaders in humiliating fashion in the past. For Genghis Khan, the Jin campaign was partly strategic and partly intensely personal. In 1211 he crossed the Great Wall. The Jin campaign was not a single swift conquest but a multi-year grinding war that exposed the resilience of a sophisticated defense and the Mongols' ability to adapt to conditions very different from the open steppe. The Jin had a large standing army, formidable fortifications, and the resources of a wealthy agricultural civilization to draw on. They also had the Great Wall itself, which was more than just a physical barrier. It was an organizational system of watchtowers and garrisons that could alert the interior to invasion and slow an advancing army. The Mongols breached it, but they found themselves fighting in terrain, the densely settled agricultural landscape of northern China with its cities, canals, and rice paddies, that was very different from what their cavalry tactics were designed for. Genghis Khan adapted. He incorporated Chinese siege engineers and adopted Chinese military technology at a rapid pace. He learned to use the Jin's own political divisions against them, exploiting the resentment of Khitan and Han Chinese populations toward their Jurchen overlords. He established a strategic pattern of raiding and devastation that sapped Jin economic and military strength over multiple campaign seasons, rather than seeking the single decisive engagement that the steppe cavalry style naturally favored. In 1215, the great Jin capital Zhengdu, a city of enormous size and sophistication, roughly on the site of modern Beijing, fell to the Mongols. The city was sacked with tremendous violence. Accounts from the period describe the streets filled with human bones, the pyres of burning buildings visible for miles. The Jin dynasty retreated south, and the Mongol campaign continued, but the heart of northern China had been struck a blow from which it would take a generation to recover. While the China campaign was ongoing, another front opened that would prove equally transformative. In the west, the Khwarezmian Empire controlled a vast swathe of Central Asia, from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India, including the great cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, and Merv, places of tremendous cultural, intellectual, and commercial significance. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, was one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world. His empire was rich, his army was numerous, and he had recently defeated a major military force from the east, giving him perhaps an inflated sense of his own military capability. The encounter between Genghis Khan and the Khwarezmian Empire began not with military force but with commerce. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a substantial trade caravan to the Khwarezmian Empire, 450 men, 500 camels, and goods worth a considerable fortune, with the intention of establishing peaceful commercial relations. The governor of the Khwarezmian border city of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, had them all arrested and eventually killed, accusing them of being spies. This may or may not have been accurate. The Mongol diplomatic and intelligence operations were so thoroughly integrated that the line between merchant and spy was genuinely blurry. But regardless of Inalchuk's reasoning, the decision was catastrophic. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to Shah Muhammad demanding either the execution of Inalchuk or his handing over for Mongol justice. The Shah had the head ambassador killed and the other two ambassadors shaved and returned in humiliation. For Genghis Khan, who held the sanctity of ambassadors as one of the most fundamental principles of his legal code, this was not merely an insult but a declaration of war that transcended ordinary politics. It was a violation so fundamental that it demanded a response of total destruction. The campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire that began in 1219 was perhaps the most devastating of all Mongol conquests in its immediate human cost. Genghis Khan divided his forces, an organizational decision that was itself a demonstration of staggering confidence, and struck the empire from multiple directions simultaneously. The Shah's strategy of distributing his forces among his many fortified cities rather than concentrating them in a field army was, with hindsight, exactly wrong. It allowed the Mongols to isolate and reduce each city in turn, without ever facing the full Khwarezmian military strength in a single engagement. Bukhara, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a center of scholarship, architecture, and trade that had been a jewel of Central Asian civilization for centuries, fell in 1220. Genghis Khan himself rode into the great mosque of Bukhara after the city's capture and addressed the survivors from the pulpit, reportedly telling them that their sins must have been enormous for God to send such a punishment upon them. Whether this account is accurate or a later embellishment is impossible to know. What is beyond doubt is that much of Bukhara was burned and a large portion of its population was killed. Samarkand fell shortly afterward. With its sophisticated city walls, its large garrison, and its strategic importance as the empire's second city, it might have been expected to hold out for a substantial siege. It didn't. The garrison numbered well over 100,000 men, but they were paralyzed by the combination of Mongol military pressure, psychological terror, and internal division. Elements of the garrison that tried to sortie and fight in the open were destroyed by the Mongol mounted archers. When the civilian population opened the gates, the garrison retreated to the citadel and eventually surrendered. Part of the population was spared, part was massacred, and the skilled craftsmen and engineers were taken away to serve Mongol needs elsewhere. Samarkand never fully recovered its pre-conquest status. City after city fell in the same pattern. Demand for surrender, sometimes a brief resistance, then capture followed by a sorting of the population into those who would be spared, typically artisans, merchants, skilled professionals, and those who submitted immediately, those who would be enslaved, and those who would be killed. The violence was not random, it was purposeful. It was the enforcement of a system that offered survival in exchange for submission and promised utter destruction for those who chose resistance. Shah Muhammad II fled westward and eventually died of illness on an island in the Caspian Sea, possibly in 1220. His son Jalal al-Din attempted to continue resistance and fought a remarkable rearguard campaign that lasted for years, winning occasional tactical victories but never able to stop the Mongol advance. The empire itself was essentially finished within 2 years of the campaign's beginning. The destruction visited upon Central Asia during the Khwarezmian campaign was not just urban. The irrigation systems that had sustained the great river valley civilizations of Transoxiana, systems that had been built and maintained over centuries, elaborate networks of canals and dams that turned the desert into farmland and supported millions of people, were destroyed either deliberately or through the simple collapse of the administrative systems that had maintained them. Modern historians using archaeological and environmental evidence have found that the population of the Merv Oasis, for example, which had been one of the most densely settled agricultural zones in the entire medieval world, declined catastrophically in the decades following the Mongol conquest. The great Persian historian Juvayni, who was himself a subject of the Mongol Empire and wrote with a complicated mixture of grief and accommodation, described the destruction of the great city of Merv in terms of complete obliteration. Whether his figures for the dead can be trusted precisely is debatable, but the broad picture of catastrophic destruction is supported from multiple directions. Two Mongol generals, Jib and Subutai, conducted a remarkable reconnaissance in force that became a campaign in its own right, chasing the remnants of the Khwarezmian army westward through Persia and into the Caucasus. They defeated the kingdoms of Georgia and Armenia, raided deep into the Crimea, encountered and destroyed a large army of Cumans and Kievan Rus princes at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, and then returned eastward through the Caspian steppes to rejoin the main army. This expedition, covering thousands of miles across territories the Mongols had never previously visited, winning every major engagement, gathering intelligence about everything they saw, was one of the most astonishing military adventures in history. It was also, in retrospect, a detailed reconnaissance of the territories that the Mongols would return to conquer in force within the next 2 decades. Genghis Khan himself turned his attention in his final years back to the Shisya, the Tangut kingdom that had failed to support him in his western campaigns. He was in his mid-60s by this point, old for the standards of the era, his body beginning to show the accumulated damage of decades of military campaigning. In late 1226 and through 1227, the Shisya was systematically destroyed. The Tangut capital was besieged. In August 1227, while the siege was still ongoing, Genghis Khan died. The circumstances of his death are recorded with varying specificity in different sources. He may have died of injuries sustained in a fall from a horse during a hunting expedition that preceded the campaign, or from illness, or from wounds received in battle. The secret history of the Mongols says he died on the 18th day of the 7th month of 1227. His body was carried back to Mongolia and buried in a secret location. A location that, if the Mongolian tradition of deliberate concealment was faithfully observed, has never been found and may never be. At the time of Genghis Khan's death, the empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Caspian Sea, already the largest contiguous land empire in history. And it was only half done. The great Khan was dead, but the machine he had built was not. Under his successors, particularly his designated heir Ogdi Khan, who formally assumed the title of Great Khan in 1229 after a 2-year regency, the empire continued to expand in every direction with a relentlessness that makes the head spin even 8 centuries later. Ogdi Khan was in many ways an ideal successor for the specific moment the empire was in. He lacked his father's particular genius for personal leadership and psychological dominance, but he had considerable organizational ability and, crucially, the wisdom to rely on the great commanders who had served under Genghis Khan. He continued the campaign to destroy the Jin dynasty, Genghis's long, grinding war against northern China, and by 1234 the Jin were finished. The last Jin emperor died in a burning palace as Mongol forces closed in. Northern China was Mongol. Ogdi also oversaw the construction of Karakorum, the first true Mongol capital city, a sign of the empire's transition from a purely nomadic fighting force to something more complex. Karakorum was not an enormous city by Chinese or Islamic standards, but its construction represented a recognition that running a continental empire required permanent institutions and a fixed administrative center. Skilled craftsmen and builders from across the conquered territories were brought there. Ambassadors from as far as Europe and the Islamic world arrived bearing gifts and seeking alliances. For a few decades, Karakorum was the nerve center of an entity that controlled the largest portion of the inhabited world any single political system had ever controlled. The Great Western Campaign that would bring the Mongols to the heart of Europe was conceived and planned with the same meticulous care that characterized all major Mongol operations. The overall strategy was developed by the genius of the veteran General Subutai, the same Subutai who had conducted the great reconnaissance of Eastern Europe and Russia with Jib a decade earlier. The operation would be commanded nominally by Bada Khan, Genghis's grandson through his eldest son Joki, but Subutai was the real strategic mind. The campaign began with the systematic conquest of the Russian principalities in 1237. The Kievan Rus world was politically fragmented. Dozens of independent principalities that maintained varying degrees of commercial and cultural relationship with each other but were incapable of military unity. This fragmentation was their fatal weakness. The Mongols arrived in the winter of 1237, beginning with the Principality of Ryazan. The Prince of Ryazan sent urgent messages to the neighboring principalities begging for military assistance. No help came. The neighboring princes calculated that helping Ryazan was too dangerous and that perhaps the storm would pass them by. It did not. Ryazan was besieged for 5 days and then sacked with a completeness that left the city effectively uninhabitable for years. The Mongol winter campaign was, from a purely tactical standpoint, an act of genuine brilliance. Every other medieval army in northern Eurasia either didn't campaign in winter at all or operated at severely reduced capability during the cold season, when mud turned to ice, when rivers froze, when supply was difficult and morale was low. The Mongols did the opposite. They preferred winter campaigning because the frozen rivers became highways for their cavalry, routes that were impassable or difficult in summer became fast corridors of advance in deep cold. The Russian defenders had no doctrine for dealing with an enemy that used the very conditions that were supposed to provide natural defense as an advantage. In rapid succession, the great cities of Kiev and Rus fell. Vladimir, Suzdal, Rostov, Yaroslavl, Torzhok, city after city was besieged, reduced, and sacked. The Cathedral of the Assumption in Vladimir, one of the great architectural achievements of medieval Russia, were set on fire with the civilian population locked inside it. The accounts of Russian chronicles from this period are apocalyptic in tone. They use the language of divine punishment, of the end of the world, of a destruction so complete that no comparison in living memory could measure it. Novgorod, the great commercial city in the northwest, was saved by the spring thaw, which turned the surrounding terrain into impassable bog before the Mongols could reach it. This may have been the most significant accident of weather in medieval Russian history. In 1240, the Mongols returned for the second phase of the Russian campaign. The great city of Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, the center of Kievan Rus civilization, the city whose name still carries the weight of centuries of cultural significance, was besieged and taken on December 6, 1240. The destruction was total. A papal envoy named Giovanni de Piendel Carpine passed through Kiev a few years after its fall and reported that the entire landscape around the city was covered with human skulls and bones. He counted what had been a major European city and found almost nothing left. The population had been somewhere between 40 and 100,000 people before the siege. Afterward, the travelers who passed through found perhaps a few hundred survivors living in ruins. It would take generations for Kiev to recover any semblance of its former significance. From Russia, the campaign turned westward toward the kingdoms of Central Europe. Subutai divided his forces into multiple columns, a signature Mongol approach to large-scale operations that maximized the area of devastation and prevented any single regional power from concentrating enough force to offer effective resistance. Poland was struck by a northern column in early 1241. The great city of Krakow was taken and burned. An alliance of Polish, German, and Teutonic Knight forces under Duke Henry II of Silesia assembled at Legnica to offer resistance. The Battle of Legnica on April 9, 1241, was a textbook demonstration of Mongol tactical superiority. Henry commanded a force of somewhere between 25 and 30,000 men that included not only Polish knights but some of the finest heavy cavalry in the Christian world: Teutonic Knights, Templars, Hospitallers, German men-at-arms. These were professional warriors of the First Order, heavily armored and superbly trained in the European tradition of shock cavalry combat. The Mongols, as they almost invariably did, opened with a feigned retreat that drew Henry's cavalry forward in pursuit, breaking their formation. A smokescreen. The Mongols are reported to have used a substance that produced choking smoke, possibly early gunpowder-based incendiary materials, disrupted the connection between the cavalry and the supporting infantry. Then the Mongols wheeled and returned, attacking from the flanks and rear. Duke Henry attempted to flee and was captured and killed. His head was displayed on a lance outside the walls of Legnica. The Mongols cut off one ear from each of the fallen European warriors to count their casualties. They filled 9 sacks. Meanwhile, the main Mongol force under Batu and Subutai had crossed the Carpathians and entered Hungary. King Bela IV of Hungary had done somewhat better than the Polish princes in terms of advance intelligence. He had received warnings, had called his barons to arms, had assembled a substantial army. But he had other problems. The Cumans, a steppe people who had fled westward ahead of the Mongol advance and sought asylum in Hungary, had created internal tensions. A Hungarian mob killed the Cuman Khan Kodani, and the outraged Cumans fled south, raiding and looting the Hungarian countryside as they went. When Bela faced the Mongols at the Battle of Mohi on April 11, 1241, 2 days after Legnica, his army was already demoralized, his political situation was in chaos, and his strategic position was hopeless. The Battle of Mohi was fought on the Sejo River in northeastern Hungary. Bata's initial attack was repulsed, and there were moments during the battle when it appeared the Mongols might actually be defeated.
A sign of how formidable the Hungarian army was even in its disadvantaged situation. But Subutai, who had crossed the river at a different point and come around the Hungarian flank, made the difference. The Mongol encirclement closed and the Hungarian army was destroyed. Bela himself escaped, but his kingdom was left defenseless. What followed was not conquest in the administrative sense but a period of sustained devastation that left perhaps half of Hungary's total population dead. The Mongol army swept across the plains of Hungary all through the summer and autumn of 1241, raiding and burning and killing. They crossed the Danube in the severe winter of 1241 to 1242, attacking western Hungarian cities and penetrating into Austria and Dalmatia. The rest of Europe was terrified. Pope Gregory IX called for a crusade. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II issued alarmed proclamations. The kings of France and England began preparing defenses.
Scholars in Western Europe wrote of the Mongols as literally diabolical, agents of divine punishment, creatures from hell. And then in the spring of 1242 the Mongols stopped, and turned around, and went home. The reason for this withdrawal is debated by historians. The most dramatic explanation, and the one most often repeated, is that Ogidi Khan died in December 1241.
And that the princes of the blood were required by Mongolian custom to return to Mongolia to participate in the election of a new great Khan. This is certainly a partial explanation. Mongolian succession required the presence of senior princes, and Batu was a major figure whose presence at the Kurultai mattered. But historians have also pointed to other factors. The terrain of Western Europe, with its dense forests and numerous rivers, was much less favorable for Mongol cavalry than the open steppe had been. The campaigns in Poland and Hungary had been harder than expected, suggesting that the deeper into Europe you went, the more the Mongol logistical advantage eroded, and the cities of Western Europe, while not unconquerable, were far more heavily fortified than anything in Russia. Whatever the reasons, the Mongol withdrawal from Central Europe left behind it a devastated landscape, a traumatized population, and an entirely new political reality. The Russian principalities were now subject peoples of the Mongol Golden Horde.
The steppe from Hungary eastward to China was Mongol territory, and the great trading city of the Crimea, Kaffa, a Genoese merchant colony on the Black Sea, was now operating under Mongol political oversight, in circumstances that would, a century later, put the city at the center of one of the most consequential events in European history. The death of Ogidi in 1241 opened a succession crisis that would ultimately, over the next 2 decades, fracture the unity of the Mongol Empire. Though the fracture would be slow and incomplete for a long time, and the empire would continue to expand even as internal tensions built. The story of the second and third generations of Mongol leadership is the story of how an extraordinary inheritance was managed, mismanaged, expanded, and eventually divided into competing pieces. Ogidi's death triggered precisely the kind of succession struggle that the Mongol system was structurally prone to. Genghis Khan had designated Ogidi as his successor, but Mongolian tradition required that the choice be ratified by a Kurultai, and in the years after Ogidi's death, his widow Temüjin Khatun held power as regent while maneuvering to secure the throne for her son Gayok. Gayok was elected Great Khan in 1246, but he was already ill and died in 1248, having barely had time to do more than consolidate his position. The succession then shifted to the Talyuid line, the descendants of Genghis Khan's youngest son Talyui, in the person of Monk Khan, who was elected Great Khan in 1251. Monk was a capable ruler who reinvigorated the expansionist program his predecessors had slowed. Under his direction, 2 simultaneous campaigns of enormous ambition were launched. His brother Hulagu was sent westward with orders to destroy the remaining Islamic powers of the Middle East, specifically to eliminate the Nizari Ismailis, the famous assassins, in their mountain fortresses, destroy the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, and if possible extend Mongol power into Syria and Egypt. His other brother Kublai was given responsibility for the conquest of the southern Song dynasty in China, completing the campaign that had begun under Genghis Khan and continued under Ogidi. Kilagu's campaign in the Middle East produced the most dramatically consequential single event of the entire Mongol era of conquest: the fall of Baghdad in 1258. Baghdad in 1258 was not the global metropolis it had been in the 9th and 10th centuries, when the Abbasid Caliphate was at its peak and Baghdad was arguably the largest city in the world. But it was still enormously important, still the seat of the Abbasid Caliph, the symbolic leader of Sunni Islam, still a major center of scholarship with its famous House of Wisdom, still one of the great cities of the Mediterranean and Islamic world, with a population historians estimate at somewhere in the hundreds of thousands. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim was not a man of the political or military caliber that the moment required. His advisors were divided. His army was underprepared. His confidence in the prestige of the caliphate as a protection against Mongol aggression was catastrophically misplaced. When Hulagu arrived with what was described as the largest Mongol army ever assembled, marshaled with 1 in 10 fighting men from across the entire empire, by the order of Monk Khan, al-Mustasim's response was in effect denial. He expected that the Muslim world would rise in his defense. It did not. The siege began at the end of January 1258. Mongol engineers, incorporating Chinese and Persian expertise, breached the walls within days. The caliph attempted to negotiate, attempted to surrender on terms, sent delegations. All were refused. Hulagu wanted unconditional capitulation, and when the caliph finally walked out of his city on February 10th, it was into a trap with no exit. The Mongols entered Baghdad on February 13th, and what followed was a week of systematic destruction. The population was massacred on a scale that shocked even contemporary observers. Houses, mosques, hospitals, and libraries were burned. The House of Wisdom, that extraordinary institution that had for centuries collected, translated, and preserved the intellectual heritage of the Greeks, Persians, Indians, and Arabs, was destroyed. The books, as the chronicles record with anguish, were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the water ran dark with ink. The caliph himself was eventually killed, rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, according to the Mongol custom of not spilling the blood of a royal prisoner directly on the earth. Estimates of the death toll in Baghdad range from 200,000 to numbers that are almost certainly exaggerated, reflecting the traumatic shock that the event represented to the Islamic world. What cannot be doubted is that it was among the most catastrophic single events of medieval history, ending the Abbasid Caliphate as a political reality, devastating one of the world's great centers of learning, and leaving Baghdad in a state of ruin from which it would not fully recover for decades or centuries. The political and cultural center of the Islamic world shifted permanently to the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, which under its remarkable Sultan Baybars would go on to defeat a Mongol army at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 in the first significant Mongol defeat in open battle, halting the westward expansion into Africa. While Hulagu was reshaping the Islamic Middle East, Kublai Khan was engaged in the long, difficult conquest of southern China. The southern Song dynasty, which had survived in the south while the north was conquered by the Mongols, proved a far tougher opponent than the Jin had been. The Song had the advantages of the complex river landscape of southern China, a larger and more sophisticated navy than anything the Mongols had encountered before, and the resources of one of the wealthiest and most populous regions on earth. The campaign would take decades. But Monk Khan's death in 1259, he died during the siege of the fortress city of Daoyuking, possibly from dysentery or from a wound, triggered yet another succession crisis that would ultimately transform the empire forever. Kublai Khan and his younger brother Erik Bok both claimed the great khanship and rival Kurultais. The ensuing civil war, the Tollywood Civil War, lasted until 1264 and ended with Kublai's victory, but the cost was permanent fragmentation. The other 3 major khanates of the empire, the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppes, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia and Iraq, had each developed their own political dynamics and would from this point operate as essentially independent entities, acknowledging Kublai's nominal supremacy as Great Khan but pursuing their own policies and even occasionally fighting each other. Kublai Khan is one of the most fascinating figures of the entire Mongol era, and he has a particular importance in world historical consciousness because it was his court that Marco Polo visited and described in such vivid, and sometimes disputed, detail. He was, in a deep sense, a man caught between 2 worlds. He was a Mongol aristocrat, grandson of Genghis Khan, raised on the steppe traditions of his people. But he had also been educated partly by Chinese Buddhist scholars, had surrounded himself with Chinese advisors, and had come to believe that governing the vast wealth and population of China required adopting the institutions and practices of Chinese imperial government. His critics among the Mongol traditionalists saw this as a betrayal. His Chinese subjects were never quite sure whether to trust a Mongol ruler who was trying to be Chinese. In 1271, Kublai formally proclaimed the Yuan dynasty, giving his Mongol realm in China a Chinese dynastic name. Yuan, the Great Origin, and positioning himself explicitly as the legitimate successor to the Chinese imperial tradition. He moved his capital from Karakoram to a newly built city in northern China that he called Dadu, the Great Capital, the site of what is today Beijing. He adopted Chinese bureaucratic institutions, restored the system of examinations for civil service positions, though with significant modifications that disadvantaged Han Chinese relative to Mongols and other non-Chinese, and made paper money backed by state authority the standard medium of exchange throughout his domain. By 1279, after years of difficult campaigning including the famous 5-year siege of the fortress city of Xiangyang that only fell when Kublai brought in Persian engineers to build the new type of counterweight trebuchet of greater range and power, the southern Song dynasty was finished. The last Song emperor, a child, died with his loyalists in a naval battle off the coast of southern China. For the first time in history, all of China was under a single non-Chinese ruler. The empire at its maximum extent in these years controlled more of the inhabited earth than any political entity had ever controlled, encompassing the Pacific coast of China, all of Mongolia, Korea, most of mainland Southeast Asia, Tibet, Afghanistan, Persia, Iraq, the Caucasus, Russia, and the western steppe to the borders of Eastern Europe. Kublai's court was a genuinely cosmopolitan place in a way that was remarkable even by the standards of a cosmopolitan age. His astronomers came from the Islamic world, his engineers from China and Persia, his physicians from every corner of the empire. He maintained correspondence with the Pope. He sponsored Buddhist monasteries and Christian churches and Islamic mosques. He employed Tibetan lamas as political advisors and Korean craftsmen as palace decorators. The Venetian merchant Marco Polo, whether you accept his account as literal truth or as a somewhat embellished composite of what he and others saw, gave European readers their first detailed picture of a civilization of extraordinary wealth and sophistication that had been more or less invisible to the West. The account of Polo's travels, however, was actually composed, electrified European intellectual circles and planted seeds of curiosity about the East that would eventually help motivate the great age of exploration 2 centuries later. Here we arrive at what may be the most consequential long-term legacy of the Mongol Empire's existence. More consequential, arguably, than any individual conquest or destruction, because it shaped the future rather than just ending the past. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was not just an absence of war. It was a genuinely new condition of the world, a transformation of the connectivity between human civilizations that had never existed in anything like this form before and would not exist again until the modern era. Before the Mongols, the Silk Road, that loose network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean world, had existed for over a millennium, and it had always been a significant conduit for goods and ideas. But it was not reliably safe. The routes passed through dozens of different political jurisdictions, each with its own taxes, its own customs, its own tolerance or hostility toward foreign merchants. A caravan traveling from China to the Levant might pass through the territories of the Jing dynasty, various Central Asian kingdoms, the Khwarezmian Empire, the Seljuk Sultanate, and various other states, each transition involving new negotiations, new fees, new dangers from bandits and raiders who operated in the gaps between administrative authority. The wealth that flowed along this route was real and substantial, but the transaction costs, in time, money, and physical risk, were enormous. When the Mongols unified the entire interior of Eurasia under a single political authority, they did something that had never happened before. They made the journey from China to Eastern Europe a journey through one kingdom instead of a dozen. The administrative implications were profound. There was now one set of rules, one currency system, largely, one postal relay network, one system of passports and safe conduct documents that could facilitate travel across the entire breadth of Asia. The YAM, the Mongol Postal Relay System, extended from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Eastern Europe, with way stations every 20 to 30 miles where fresh horses and provisions were available to authorized travelers. A message could travel from China to Persia in weeks rather than months. A diplomat could cross half the world with a bronze or gold tablet, the Paizi or Jerich, inscribed with Kublai Khan's authority, and find that this document commanded obedience, provisioning, and protection at every way station he passed. The commercial impact was immediate and substantial. The historian and merchant Francesco Pegolotti, writing in the 1340s for the benefit of Italian merchant families considering trade with China, described the road from the Black Sea port of Tana to China as perfectly safe, whether by day or by night. This was not naive optimism, it was a business assessment by a professional who was advising people risking serious capital. Safety along the Silk Road was not absolute. There were still local rulers who died and created brief periods of instability. There were still occasional bandits in remote stretches. But compared to what the route had been before Mongol unification, it was a transformation. What flowed along these newly safe routes changed the world in ways that are still echoing. From east to west, Chinese silk in its many varieties, porcelain of extraordinary quality that Europeans had never seen and could not produce, paper and the knowledge of paper making, printing technology, gunpowder and the knowledge of its composition, silk weaving techniques, astronomical instruments and astronomical knowledge, mathematical concepts, medical knowledge including Chinese pharmacological traditions, and spices from the further reaches of the Asian trade network. From west to east, European silver, the great monetary engine of medieval European trade, fine woolens, horses of the breeds the Mongols prized, glass-working techniques, and the knowledge of European commercial practices like bills of exchange and insurance instruments that the long-distance merchants brought with them. The exchange was not just of goods but of ideas, and here the effects were perhaps even more transformative in the long run. Islamic mathematics and astronomy made their way into Chinese scholarship under the Mongol sponsorship. Kublai Khan maintained an astronomical observatory staffed by Muslim scholars from the Middle East alongside Chinese astronomers, and the cross-pollination of these two traditions produced genuinely new advances in both fields. Chinese medical knowledge moved westward and influenced Islamic medicine. The concept and technology of paper money moved from China through the Mongol administrative system into the Islamic world and eventually into European commercial practice. The bill of exchange, a financial instrument that would be essential to the development of modern banking and commerce, was adopted and spread by merchants traveling along Mongol-protected routes. The religious exchanges of the Pax Mongolica deserve attention as well. The Mongols, as already discussed, were genuinely religiously tolerant in a way that was unusual for any major medieval power. Nestorian Christianity, a branch of the faith that had been pushed out of the Western Christian world through the great Christological controversies of the 5th century, experienced a remarkable revival across Central Asia during the Pax Mongolica, because the Nestorian churches were protected and their clergy treated with respect. Tibetan Buddhism spread from Tibet through Mongolia and into the Mongol courts, becoming eventually the dominant religion of the Mongolian people, a position it holds to this day. Islam spread into new areas of the steppe as Mongol rulers in the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate converted, bringing their subjects with them. The Ilkhan Ghazan's conversion to Islam in 1295 was a decisive moment. Within a generation, the Ilkhanate's Persian subjects found themselves governed by rulers who shared their faith, if not their culture. The city of Samarkand, which had been devastated by Genghis Khan's initial conquest of Central Asia, recovered under Mongol rule to become once again a great center of commerce and culture, this time with an even more diverse population than before, drawing scholars, merchants, and artisans from across the entire span of the empire. The Mongol capital Karakorum, far to the north on the steppe, was by the mid-13th century a genuinely international place. The Flemish missionary William of Rubruck, who visited Karakorum in 1253 and 1254 as an envoy of the French King Louis IX, left an account that describes what he found there with a combination of wonder and bewilderment. He found a Parisian goldsmith who had been kidnapped during the Mongol invasion of Hungary and had ended up in Karakorum making silver objects for the Mongol court. He found Chinese monks, Nestorian priests, Muslim imams, and practitioners of every religion of the known world in peaceful coexistence. He found a city that would have been unimaginable from the perspective of any single one of the civilizations that had contributed to its remarkable, impossible cosmopolitanism. The Venetian merchant family of the Polos, Niccolo Maffeo, and eventually the famous Marco, traveled to the court of Kublai Khan in the 1260s and 1270s precisely because the Pax Mongolica had made such a journey possible. They carried with them the Pope's request for 100 Christian scholars and some oil from the lamp of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Kublai received them warmly and sent them back with gifts and a golden tablet authorizing their return and demanding that the Pope send him men of learning. The account that eventually emerged from Marco Polo's travels, whether dictated by Polo himself to a romance writer named Rustichello da Pisa while both were prisoners in Genoa, or compiled from multiple sources, or embellished in ways that are now impossible to entirely untangle, introduced to a European audience the vivid reality of a civilization that had existed at the edges of European geographical consciousness as pure legend, the vast wealth of Cathay, the sophisticated administrative organization of the Yuan dynasty, the paper money economy, the coal that the Chinese used for heating, the elaborate postal relay system, the great cities. These descriptions were initially received with considerable skepticism. Polo was nicknamed Il Million, a reference to his habit of describing things in millions, his listeners clearly assuming he was exaggerating wildly. But many of the things he described that seemed most incredible have since been confirmed by other sources. The Mongol Empire formally dissolved as a unified political entity over the course of the late 13th and 14th centuries, fracturing along the lines of the successor khanates that had been forming since Kublai's victory in the Temüjin Civil War. The Yuan dynasty in China lasted until 1368, when a Chinese peasant rebellion led by a former Buddhist monk named Zhu Yuanzhang drove the last Mongol emperor from Beijing and established the Ming dynasty. The Ilkhanate in Persia effectively ended with the death of the last effective Ilkhan, Abu Sa'idi, in 1335, and fragmented into competing successor states. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia broke up into eastern and western halves that would eventually be absorbed or transformed by new powers. The Golden Horde in Russia lasted longest, maintaining a shadow presence in the politics of the Russian steppe well into the 15th century before finally dissolving under pressure from the rising Muscovite princes, who were themselves in some ways the inheritors of political and administrative traditions shaped by their centuries under Mongol rule. The question of what the Mongols left behind, what their ultimate legacy to human history was, has been debated by historians for as long as historians have studied them, and the debate remains genuinely unresolved in interesting ways. The difficulty is that the legacy is simultaneously a legacy of destruction and of creation, and the two are so deeply intertwined that they cannot be cleanly separated. Start with the destruction because it is real and it deserves to be named clearly. The total death toll from the Mongol conquests is a number that cannot be stated with anything like precision, but historians have attempted estimates that range from 40 million to as high as 60 million people killed across the full span of the conquests. Timothy May, one of the most careful modern historians of the Mongol period, offers a more conservative estimate but still one that represents an almost incomprehensible scale of violence. The population of Central Asia and Persia, particularly the great river valley civilizations of Transoxiana and Khorasan, did not recover to pre-conquest levels for generations, in some areas for centuries. The destruction of irrigation infrastructure in areas like the Merv Oasis had environmental consequences that outlasted the empire itself. Landscapes that had been farmed and settled for millennia became depopulated and remained so. The intellectual heritage destroyed in the sack of Baghdad, the libraries, the scholars, the accumulated translations of ancient texts, represents a loss that cannot be quantified but that clearly set back certain branches of scholarship, at least temporarily. The conquest of Eastern Europe, even though it was not sustained into permanent Mongol rule in Poland and Hungary, left those societies traumatized and restructured. The depopulation of certain regions was significant enough to create the conditions for subsequent German eastward colonization of territories that had previously been more densely settled by Polish-speaking populations. The Russian principalities, which bore the full weight of sustained Mongol rule for more than 2 centuries under the Golden Horde, were transformed in ways that historians still argue about. Russia's relative isolation from Western European cultural and institutional developments during the 14th and 15th centuries, its divergence from the trajectory of Western European political development, is attributed by some historians at least partly to the Mongol period and the specific ways in which the Golden Horde system of rule shaped Russian political culture. The princes of Moscow rose partly through their effectiveness as tax collectors for their Mongol overlords, and this role shaped the centralized, autocratic political traditions of Muscovite Russia in ways that echo through Russian history down to the present day. But alongside the destruction, the creation. The Pax Mongolica and its effects on Eurasian connectivity and trade were not merely temporary phenomena that ended with the empire. They had permanent effects on what was possible in terms of cross-civilizational contact and knowledge exchange. The technologies that moved along the Silk Road during the Mongol era, gunpowder, printing, papermaking, the compass, certain astronomical instruments, eventually helped trigger the scientific and technological revolutions of early modern Europe. The argument is not that the Mongols directly caused the European Renaissance, which would be a significant overstatement, but that the intensified connectivity of the Pax Mongolica era put certain technologies and ideas into European circulation that had previously been absent or present only in fragmentary form. Printing technology in particular moved from China westward during the Mongol period, and while Gutenberg's press in the 1450s was an independent European invention, the underlying concept of printing with movable type, and the paper on which it printed, both had Chinese origins that were more widely known in Europe after the Mongol era than before. The compass, another Chinese invention that had made its way westward through the Mongol trade network, was essential to the great age of European maritime exploration that began in the late 15th century. The expeditions that Columbus, da Gama, and Magellan led were only possible because European navigators had access to navigational technology that was partly of Chinese origin. Columbus himself, famously, was motivated in part by his reading of Marco Polo's account of Kublai Khan's China and his desire to find a sea route to those riches that Polo had described. The connection between the Mongol Empire and the European discovery of the Americas, while indirect, is real. Remove the Pax Mongolica from history and Marco Polo doesn't reach China. Remove Marco Polo's account from European intellectual culture, and Columbus may not make his particular voyage in 1492. The world is, at every level, less obviously connected than it actually is. The genetic legacy of the Mongol Empire is another dimension that has attracted enormous attention. A landmark study published in the early 2000s identified a Y chromosome lineage, the genetic signature passed through the male line, that is carried by approximately 8% of men across a vast swathe of Central Asia, representing roughly 16 million men at the time of the study. The researchers argued that this lineage was most plausibly explained as the genetic inheritance of a single man who lived in Mongolia approximately 1,000 years ago and who had an extraordinary number of descendants due to both his own enormous family and the reproductive advantage conferred by his descendants' high status and access to multiple wives. The implication that this was the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan himself, or of a very close male relative, was widely reported. More recent research published in 2026, using far more sophisticated genomic analysis techniques, has somewhat complicated this picture, suggesting that the specific lineage identified may not belong to Genghis Khan directly but to a broader cluster of Mongol elite males from the relevant period, and that the genealogical assignment is less certain than the original study implied. But the underlying demographic reality, that the Mongol conquests produced an extraordinary expansion of a particular genetic heritage across Asia, remains well established. The Mongol ruling class had access to large numbers of women, both wives and concubines, drawn from every population they conquered, and their descendants inherited their political status and with it the same reproductive advantages. Over the course of 2 or 3 generations, the genetic signature of the Mongol elite became embedded in the populations of dozens of conquered nations in ways that no other historical event has paralleled. The political map that the Mongol era bequeathed to subsequent centuries is perhaps its most immediately visible legacy. The borders and political configurations that the Mongol conquests created did not simply disappear when the empire fragmented. They persisted, in modified forms, for generations. The Russian state that eventually emerged from under the Golden Horde's shadow was the Grand Duchy of Moscow, whose princes had built their power partly through their collaboration with Mongol administrative structures, and whose political culture had been shaped by 2 centuries of interaction with Mongol governance. The Ottoman Empire that would go on to dominate the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe for 6 centuries was partly a creation of the political vacuum left by the Mongol destruction of the Seljuk Sultanate and the Abbasid Caliphate. The Ming dynasty that replaced the Mongol Yuan in China was in many ways a reaction against the Mongol period, a conscious Chinese reassertion of native Chinese political culture. But even in its reactions, it was shaped by what it was reacting against. The Ilkhanate's conversion to Islam and its subsequent sponsorship of Persian language and culture in Iran contributed to the extraordinary flowering of Persian literature, art, and architecture that characterized the Timurid and Safavid periods. The period when the great Persian miniature painting tradition reached its apex, when the poets and scholars whose work still forms the core of the Persian literary canon were active, when the architectural marvels of Isfahan were built. This cultural renaissance was, paradoxically, fertilized by the very conquest that had seemed to threaten the destruction of Persian civilization. The shock of conquest, followed by the absorption of the conquerors into the rich civilization they had seized, produced something new and unexpected. The relationship between the Mongol Empire and the Black Death is perhaps the darkest and most consequential of all these legacies. The plague that swept across Eurasia beginning in the 1340s and killing somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Europe, and comparable proportions in the Islamic world and China, was facilitated in its rapid spread by the very trade networks and connectivity that the Pax Mongolica had created. The bacterium that causes bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, originates in reservoir populations of rodents in Central Asia. Under normal circumstances, it causes occasional local outbreaks but does not spread widely because the populations of wild rodents it inhabits are isolated from the human flea-rat transmission chains that enable the disease to reach urban populations. The Mongol expansion moved people, animals, and goods across Central Asia on a scale that had never previously existed, and in doing so, created the conditions for the plague to make the jump into the long-distance trade networks where it could travel rapidly across the known world. The Mongol siege of the Genoese trading city of Kaffa in the Crimea in 1345 to 1346 has been identified as a likely turning point in the plague's spread to Europe. The Mongol forces catapulted the bodies of plague victims over the city's walls. The disease entered the city, and when the Genoese merchants finally evacuated by ship, they took the plague with them to Sicily and thence to the rest of Europe. This too is somewhat debated. The epidemiological picture is complex and the evidence is not conclusive in every detail. But the broad connection between the Mongol trade network and the plague's westward spread is accepted by the majority of historians. The Black Death that killed a third of Europe in 4 years was the dark shadow of the same connectivity that had brought silk and spice and paper and gunpowder westward along the same routes. The Mongols, in the end, cannot be placed neatly into any simple historical category. They were neither the pure destroyers of the most lurid popular imagination, nor the enlightened empire builders of a too sympathetic revisionism. They were something more genuinely complex and more genuinely interesting than either caricature. A people of extraordinary capability who emerged from conditions of extreme hardship, who built something unprecedented, who caused suffering on a scale that challenges the imagination, and who also, by the sheer force of their reorganization of Eurasia, created conditions that made possible exchanges and connections and ultimately transformations that would shape the world long after the empire itself was gone. The grass of the Mongolian steppe grows over the graves of their khans and their warriors alike. The secret burial ground of Genghis Khan has never been found. The deliberate concealment was too good, or the centuries too long, or the landscape too vast. But his absence from any identifiable grave is somehow appropriate. The great conqueror who believed Tingri had given him dominion over the world resists being pinned down even in death. He is everywhere in the genetic heritage of 40 million living people, in the political boundaries that still reflect his conquests, in the trade routes whose opening helped create modernity, in the very idea that the world was connected, that what happened in China mattered in Europe, and what happened in Persia mattered in Russia, and what happened on the Mongolian steppe could matter to every civilization on earth. That idea, the idea of a connected world, is one of the most important ideas in the history of human civilization. And it was written in blood and silk and fire by the writers of the great steppe. There is one more dimension of the Mongol legacy that deserves to be named before we close. The question of what the Mongols did to the very concept of statehood and governance in the regions they ruled. In Russia, as already noted, the Mongol period shaped the development of the Muscovite political tradition in profound ways. The princes of Moscow learned from the Mongols how to centralize tribute collection, how to manage vast territories through intermediate administrators, how to use a standardized communication network to maintain control over distant populations. The autocratic tendencies of Russian political culture, the tradition of centralized power, of the rulers standing above the law rather than being bound by it, of the state as a machine of extraction rather than a contract with its subjects, have roots that historians have traced, at least in part, to the specific institutional lessons the Russian princes learned during their centuries of subordination to and collaboration with the Golden Horde. In China, the Yuan dynasty's relatively brief occupation left marks that were paradoxically productive. The Ming dynasty, founded explicitly in reaction to Mongol rule, developed its particular form of fierce cultural conservatism. Its insistence on Chinese traditions, its suspicion of foreign influence, its eventual decision to withdraw from the maritime exploration program that had sent great fleets across the Indian Ocean under Admiral Zheng He, partly as a reaction against the cosmopolitanism that had characterized the Yuan court. The very walls that enclosed Ming China were, in a sense, walls built against the memory of the Mongols. And yet the Ming dynasty also inherited from the Yuan the administrative geography of an integrated China, the canal systems that Kublai Khan had extended and improved, and the paper money economy that the Yuan had established. In the Islamic world, the end of the Abbasid Caliphate as a living political institution, the event that the sack of Baghdad in 1258 definitively accomplished, created a power vacuum that reshaped Sunni Islam in permanent ways. The Caliphate had been, for 500 years, the nominal center of a unified Islamic world, the institution around which Sunni political theory organized itself. After 1258, it could only exist as a shadow institution maintained by whoever found it politically useful. First the Mamluks in Cairo, then eventually the Ottomans in Istanbul. The practical decentralization of Islamic political authority that followed meant that no single Islamic power could ever again speak for the entire faith, which had both liberating and fragmenting consequences that are still working themselves out in the politics of the Muslim world today. The Mongols also left behind something else, something harder to quantify but just as real. The knowledge that the world was bigger, more connected, and more vulnerable to interconnected catastrophe than anyone had previously understood. The Black Death was a direct consequence of the connectivity that the Pax Mongolica had created. But so was the European Renaissance, at least in part. So was the Age of Exploration. So was the first genuinely global economy. The same network that carried the plague also carried the spices that made a Venetian merchant wealthy, the paper on which Dante wrote the Commedia, the astronomical knowledge that helped Copernicus think about the structure of the solar system, the compass that guided Columbus's ships toward the Americas. History does not sort its consequences neatly into good and evil columns. The Mongol legacy is the history of the world's first experience of genuine, painful, transformative globalization. And the world we live in today, with all its connectivity and all its vulnerability, is descended from that experience in ways we have only begun to fully understand. And that's where we'll leave the Mongols tonight, not at the moment of their greatest conquests, but at the long view, the slow look back across the centuries at what they built and what they broke and what they left in the soil of the world that would grow into things they could never have imagined. One of history's most complicated legacies, and one of its most important stories. A story that began on a cold and windswept plain and ended up reshaping the entire arc of human civilization. If this journey through the Mongol Empire kept you company tonight, I'd love it if you hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more curious listeners. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Every week there's a new chapter of the human story waiting to unfold here on The Drowsy Archivist. Until then, thank you for spending your night in good historical company. Sleep well. Good night.